we have a major advantage point, like unlike the piano, for example, the vibes, if you go from like C to C sharp, there's, you can't do a glissando, it's basically, the notes are everything is like kind of broken up, from, in half steps. But on the bass, just like a vocalist, we have the advantage of being able to have a glissando from one note to the next, and that's pretty much the most vocal-like thing, that we can think of. So that's a great advantage point that we can really use in order to be more expressive, in our soloing.
I put out a call for guest ideas for my recent New York City trip, and a name that came back time and time again is today's guest. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and yes, we are chatting with Marco Panacea, who has been requested not just in terms of this New York trip that I did, but over the years, he has been requested time and time again, and I'm so glad that we got to sit down in person while I was in New York with Marco. What an eloquent guy. What a great journey he takes us on in this show. And we cover things like how he found himself in the United States, growing up in Italy, what that whole story is, and how he established his career in the U.S., getting to gigs via train and on foot, some crazy gig stories, being versatile, and all kinds of other topics. He's such a great guy and awesome player and very eloquent, as you'll hear. So I'm really, really thrilled to bring you this today. And I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, Upton Bass, Steve Swan String Bass, D'Addario Strings, Colstein Music, and the Bass Violin Shop. Thank you so much for making trips like this to New York possible, and you'll hear more about them later. But let's dig into this conversation with Marco Panacea. One of my most requested guests, Marco Panacea. We're here in New York City chatting. It says, just thank you for chatting. This is going to be a lot of fun.
It's my pleasure.
And you've done so much. It's kind of overwhelming. I don't even know where to start, but maybe we could start with, you're from Italy originally,
that's right. Yep.
From Venice, and just tell us about your early years prior to coming to the United States.
Yeah, sure. Well, I moved to the United States when I was 25 years old. I'm 45 now, so I guess, it's been 20 years already. They have kind of flown by. But I started out as a pianist, actually. I started taking piano lessons when I was about 8 years old. And those lessons they lasted about 5 years. So I remember I was a kid at the time, and all I wanted to do, like every Italian kid would, like, I was into soccer, just doing all the things, that like an 8 or a 10-year-old Italian kid would want to do. So I didn't love practicing the piano that much, but on the other hand, I'm really grateful for those years of classical piano training, because they really helped me in terms of like sight reading. And getting a great theoretical background. And also they taught me how to read in bass clef. So when I actually started playing the bass, I already had my reading together from my piano years. So as much as I kind of hated it as a kid, it really came in handy when I eventually graduated to the bass.
Yeah. And you ended up in Sicily and were there for quite some time.
Yeah, that's right, because that's where my parents are from originally. So we moved back there.
I've never been to Sicily. I was just in Italy for the first time this summer, but Rome, Florence, Lucca. What's Sicily like for those of us that haven't been there?
Well, it's really beautiful. The one great thing about it is that the climate is very they call it Mediterranean kind of climate. So it's very temperate year round. We really don't have a winter per se. You have to think sort of like San Diego or like LA, this kind of beautiful, like permanent spring-like weather. And, I mean, if it gets down to like, 55 degrees, it's like, everybody freaks out. It's like the coldest kind of weather that they've ever experienced, so it's a beautiful place to live. We have beautiful beaches, so it's great to go there in the summertime. And, it's just a great place and also full of great musicians. There's a great musical tradition for all genres of music. And I'm really grateful for, having had my upbringing there, because I had a great classical bass teacher named Nello Nicotra. He was a student of Gary Carr and Petracchi. So he gave me a lot of great insights for the 4 years that I studied with him. And even though I ended up being more of a jazz player than a classical player, I definitely cherish, the time that I spent, studying with him, because he gave me some really great foundation.
Well, it's such a great tradition of bass playing in Italy.
Yeah.
And somebody actually asked this question that I'd just love to hear about. But we people in the United States or some in Northern Europe are confused by the third finger on the left hand. Is that the way you learned is 1, 3, 4?
Yeah, it is.
Talk about that, because I understand it, having had some conversations, but there's some mystery around it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody that spent time, with a belay method, which is kind of like our Simandl, knows that there's no such thing as 1, 2, 4, but everything is notated 1, 3, 4. So basically, what we do as young bass players, starting out at the conservatory, like with a classical teacher, the teacher has us put an elastic band between the second and the third finger. So this goes on for about a year. When you're like starting with the first position of the lower positions of the bass. So I still have my second and third fingers kind of joined together. Yeah. Like, I mean, I can still see this imaginary, like, little elastic band, putting them together. And then, of course, as years went by, I really came to realize that 1, 2, 4 is more logical, in terms of comfort and like the way that the hand is, like, the way that the hand is.
Right.
But the thing is that, I've had that original imprinting, with playing with the third finger. So now I kind of have a hard time, like shaking it off, So my fingerings are very, sometimes I play 1 through 4, sometimes I play 1, 2, 4, and in the middle of the neck, I like to play 1, 2, 3, 4. So, I guess I use all kinds of fingerings, but eventually, my number one concern is to try and sound good,
Right.
So, however way I achieve that, probably doesn't matter that much, I guess.
Right. Yeah, it's a good concern to have.
Yeah, that's right.
You left Sicily at 25, and Berklee School of Music was your first stop in the United States.
That's right. That was my ticket to America.
Okay. Why Berklee? What? Talk about that decision.
Yeah, well, I kept hearing about Berklee for a long time. When I was a younger budding musician. And as I mentioned, a lot of people know that I was actually about to graduate in chemistry. I thought that music was going to be a kind of a side hobby. But then the Berklee opportunity came because Berklee contingent comes to Italy every summer for the Umbria Jazz Festival. It's a very, very major, important jazz festival that happens every year, and it has, for the past like 40 years or so. And so Berklee, basically they host clinics, during the festival. So they're teaching students there for about a week, and then at the end of the week they give out scholarships. So I thought, why not? Let's give this a try. So they gave me a very good scholarship. It covered more than half of my tuition. So I figured, let's give this a try. I'll go to Boston for 1 semester and then come right back to Italy and finish my chemistry degree. And also I was studying classical bass at the time. I was like in my 4th year. So I was like, okay, I'll just put everything on hold, see what living in the U.S. is like for a musician. And, I'll stay there for like 3 or 4 months and go right back. That was 20 years ago, and I'm still here in the U.S. So I guess I just went with the flow, and I saw that Berklee, really worked out for me because it was an amazing educational environment for me. I was able to basically do it all. I pride myself on being as versatile a musician as I can possibly be. I don't like to be boxed into one particular style. So I was able to play, still play arco, with, Berklee Chamber Orchestra, string orchestra they have there. I was playing electric bass, with a pop group, called, they make a yearly concert called Singers Showcase. And then, of course, I was playing a lot of jazz. And I was really practicing a lot. I mean, I was practicing, 6 to 8 hours a day. Yeah, so it was a really, conducive environment, for me to grow as a musician overall in a number of styles. Yeah.
What were you practicing those 6 or 8 hours? I'd love to know. Was it with the bow? Was it learning tunes, transcribing?
Yeah, all of that. I was doing a lot of transcribing, because I was taking a couple of classes that would require a weekly transcription, and as you know, transcribing does take a lot of time. Yeah. Especially in those years, we're talking about like 99, 2000, where computers were still very slow. There was no such thing as like, I guess Finale and Sibelius had already hit the scene, but, computers were very clunky at the time. So like, most of the times you were just better off, using your pen and paper, right, and just doing it the traditional way. So, and I really learned a lot. I remember, at the time, when I first got to Berklee, I was really into Dave Holland's playing. It was like my number one influence. But then through this great teacher that I had there named Whit Brown, I started getting more into the Ray Brown, Ron Carter, Christian McBride school of playing. And that kind of stuck with me ever since, because I think those are definitely my main influences still to this day. And I remember transcribing one Ray Brown song in particular, with the Oscar Peterson Trio, just a rendition of a standard called Sometimes I'm Happy. Mm-hmm. And I remember it was like really life-changing for me. It taught me so much in terms of like a great choice of notes when, walking a line, mm-hmm, or, that playing in a bluesy way, then a lot of chord substitutions, tritone subs and that kind of stuff. It was basically like that one song, it taught me so much in a number of ways, and it kind of opened a lot of doors for me in terms of like knowledge of harmony and phrasing and everything. So, I'm thankful for my teacher at the time, who, invited me to, do this transcription, because it was really like, a life-changing moment.
I got to ask, being from Sicily, and the coldest it gets is 55 degrees or something. Right. Then you go to New England, Boston. Yeah. What was that first winter like for you? Or what was just the experience of going to U.S. City in a place like Boston? Well, that must have been quite a contrast.
Yeah. It was pretty brutal. Yeah. I won't put it lightly. First of all, I remember I landed in Boston on January 4th. And there was a big snowstorm going on. I don't even remember how the plane was able to land, because it was like this huge mess of a snowstorm. And I remember I had I brought my bass from Italy, in this huge trunk. Back in the days, when it was still fairly easy to travel with a full-size trunk. I had my electric bass and I had like 2 pieces of luggage. It was insane, and I remember I had to negotiate a lot of snow, in the streets. And I was staying, a friend of mine was studying at Berklee, and she let me use her room, while she was in Italy for the winter break. It was like a 5th floor walk up. So I had to basically, with like very narrow stairs. We're talking like a townhouse, kind of with those like really like tiny, spiraling stairs. And I had to negotiate everything on my own. And I was like, oh my God, what am I putting myself into? Yeah.
I have nightmares of those kind of stairways. I have a recurring dream of walking down one of those stairways, losing my footing, and sliding down with my bass on top of me, which that's almost happened. Never really. But those walk-ups are no joke.
Yeah. It was pretty brutal. At the time I was 25, so I just dealt with it, when you're young, nothing really bothers you, but if they asked me to do the same thing today, I would probably just like hire somebody off the street, I need help here. Yeah.
So you're in the U.S., you're in Boston, your career is already developing. How long were you at Berklee? How many years?
Well, I was there, basically, I was able to test out of a lot of things. Like a lot of classes, that I felt I was already prepared for, like ear training and harmony and all that. So I could have technically finished in 2 years. And I was almost done, but then I found out that Joe Lovano was coming to teach. So I basically just decided to stay just so that I could take his classes for a year. So I was there for like 3.5 years. And, I don't regret staying for longer, because those classes with Joe were really amazing. And then, all my colleagues at the time, when we're in our senior year, we're applying for graduate, school. Mm-hmm. So I did as well. And I applied for Manhattan School of Music and they gave me a full scholarship. So I was like, okay, I got to go to New York. And so that was like the official excuse for me to move to New York, kind of go for my master's. And so that's kind of how it all happened, and I'm still here.
So that move then from Boston to New York, headed to New York, the jazz capital of the world, I think, and nobody would dispute that. Yeah. What was that transition like, going from Boston to living in New York?
Yeah, well, it was pretty intense, because Boston is a really lovely city, but it's very small. I mean, in a way, in comparison, it feels like a small village, and everything kind of shuts down at like 8 or 9 p.m. There's no such thing as like, nightlife or late night gigs. I mean, here in New York, when they say that it's a 24-hour city, it's really true. I can confirm it. Sometimes, there are a couple of clubs in the village where there will be gigs that start at 1:30 a.m. and they go until 4 a.m. That means that basically I'm leaving home to go to my gig at like 12:30 a.m. Like, in the middle of the night, I'm taking the train, which is kind of unreal. And then having a gig that ends at 4 a.m. means that basically I won't go to bed until like 6:30 a.m. So, I guess that this is one of the very few places in the world, where this kind of stuff can happen, but it really does.
It's the only city in the United States for sure. I can confirm that living in San Francisco. You go out at midnight in San Francisco and it's like the zombie apocalypse. There's nobody out except, people on the streets, and you're kind of watching your back, and everything's shut down. Last year, I had a layover I had 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. to do something. And so what did I do?
I remember that.
Yeah.
So you went for a beer.
I went for beers. I went for Korean food. I ate some pizza at 3 a.m.
Yeah,
and everybody, and it's just.
You could totally do it.
Yeah, you could totally do it. And it's just that what a different scene. What an exciting scene.
Yeah, that's right. So it is very overwhelming. I remember when I was still living in Boston, like around 99, I came here in August, for like a quick, like day-long visit. And I really hated it. I was like, I could never live in a jungle of a city like this, It was hot and humid, how nasty it gets here, like weather-wise in August. And, so I was like, no, I'll never, ever move here, and guess what? I've been living here for like 16 years. Yeah. So sometimes, just life takes you to, unexpected, places, in terms of like, you just basically decide that the wisest thing to do is to just go with the flow and roll with it, Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They proudly offer the largest variety of fine basses and bows in the Southeast. You can find something at every price point by makers such as Thomas Martin, Bill Lakeberg, Romano Solano, Lemur Music, all Shen models, K, Epiphone, and bows by Louis Morizot, Fuchs, Nürnbergo, Arcos Brazil, and others. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. Upton Bass has an interesting philosophy in terms of selling basses to people. Here's Eric of Upton on the topic.
I don't want to sell you one bass. Right. I want to sell you like 4. When you're in high school or college or just starting out, or you just, 30 years been playing double bass or electric bass, and now you're on your first double bass, you're starting off with a $2,500 laminate. And then I want you to outgrow it. I want you to come back and say, now I'm ready for the hybrid. Oh, now I'm ready for the solid wood bass.
Wherever you are on that trajectory, Upton has a bass to meet your needs. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. A question I like to ask people on the podcast is, what advice would they give their 18-year-old self? And here's Barry Colstein of Colstein & Sons answering that very question.
I think as an 18-year-old and, you know, or even in my early 20s coming into the shop, everything like that, a lot of it was laid out for me. There was a plan, you know, that I was given a plan, which I often say I've done a good job, and I'm proud of what I've done with the shop, and I continue to be proud. But, you know, I was given an opportunity, and I always respect self-made people, you know, that weren't given that opportunity. It's what you do with the opportunity.
Barry has been providing bassists with opportunities through beautiful instruments, bows, cases, you name it. He's been doing this himself for 50 years, and the shop is celebrating their 70th year in business. Thank you so much for what you do, Barry. Check them out at Colstein.com, and thank you for sponsoring the podcast.
I got to ask you, back in Boston, so Joe Lovano and spending time with him, what was he like as a teacher? What really inspired you about working with him?
Yeah, well, I mean, he just basically he really let us do our thing. I mean, it was really about, I think there are two kinds of teachers, you know, in the world. There are teachers that really, you know, dictate every single aspect of what you do. I mean, like, you know, they really like want you to sound like themselves or like do specific things. But with him, it was really all about helping us find our own voice, you know. So he would really like encourage us to kind of just do our thing, you know, and redevelop that. So there was like a really important message for me, you know. Yeah. That's something that I try to do with my own students as well. I mean, I don't like to dictate too much, you know, like, you know, this is how you should do it, this is wrong, this is right, you know. Like I really try to assess, you know, where they are at that particular stage in their lives and try to give them advice so that their own musical selves, you know, can shine even more.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I've seen that myself too. There are people, you look at a studio or you look at people studying with a particular teacher, and sometimes they all kind of play like that teacher, and then sometimes they're all great, but they all play their own different way. And that's the teacher that excites me.
Yeah, that's right. Because I mean, we're all individuals, you know, we're all unique. I mean, there's no way that anyone could ever really sound like anyone else, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I'm all for trying to learn as much as you can from the masters, you know, from the great bass players that have come before us. But at the same time, you know, I think that it's good to just use that as a starting point to really like kind of develop your own musical self even more. Yeah. I mean, like basically what you're getting from the masters is really the nuts and bolts, you know, the basic stuff that you can really, you know, use to enhance your own vocabulary in terms of technique and knowledge of harmony and everything, and then like kind of take it as a starting point to redo your own thing.
Well, and those master teachers, people like Joe Lovano and some other teachers and influences in your life, you then get to New York, and then who are some of those other people that looking back really influenced you the most once you got to New York? I know you had lots of people that had been in that role.
Yeah. Well, you know, one more teacher that I'd like to mention was really great for me was actually the last bass teacher that I had at Berklee. His name is Dave Santoro. He's a great educator, and with him, his lessons were all about like, you know, kind of real life playing situations. I mean, like, you know, we didn't get too much into theory and stuff. I mean, we would just like, you know, pretend, you know, that we were playing with other musicians. And he's also a very good pianist, you know, so sometimes we would play duets, you know, with him accompanying me on piano. And so it was like kind of a 360-degree kind of a educational experience, you know, because like I learned a lot, not just like about the bass technically, but I learned a lot about harmony and playing with other musicians, you know. So I think that his teachings really got me ready for New York, you know, more than anyone else. So I'm really grateful. And I mean, here in New York, you know, the level is really, the musicianship is really so high. Yeah. I mean, and I'm not talking just about the masters, you know, but I'm talking about my peers as well. I do believe that there's something to learn from everyone. And I'm not talking just about bass players. You know, sometimes, you know, the mistake we make as bass players is to kind of have sort of like a tunnel vision and kind of look up to, you know, just bass players, you know, for inspiration. But there's actually a lot to learn from all the instruments. So, And for example, for my own soloing, like people often ask me, what are your main influences? And sometimes I find myself mentioning, that I've learned as much from bass players than I had from guitar players and horn players and piano players, because each instrument has something that we can learn from in terms of phrasing and knowledge of harmony and everything. So, yeah.
Do you have any? I'd love to know that, like in your own teaching. I've done very limited jazz teaching, but mostly classical teaching. But I have been in the position where working with students on transcriptions and trying to think of. Do you have any recommendations? Like if someone wants to learn start getting into soloing and learn a diverse range of styles. Do you have any go-to transcriptions like a Miles Davis for something from Kind of Blue? Or what are some of your favorite places to start?
Definitely. Well, I recommend a solo that's very important to transcribe is, of course, Miles Davis's solo on So What?
Yeah.
Because he really takes, Miles really takes his time, developing his musical ideas, and it actually sits very well on the bass. Mm-hmm. So that's something I really recommend, and also I recommend any solos by Chet Baker, because Chet was extremely clear in his delivery of his musical ideas. So I recommend this solo in particular on the song called "It Could Happen to You." I think they do it in a different key. Maybe they do it in the key of G instead of like the key of E flat that tune is generally played from in. But I really recommend it because it's a fairly slow tempo, but there's a lot of great information in there in terms of like arpeggio playing and just playing like all the right notes, like the flat 9 on a dominant chord, that kind of thing. So I really recommend those two solos as a starting point.
And both very melodic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Incredibly melodic material.
Absolutely, very, very melodic. Yeah, that's like the most important thing. You have to really be able to sing through your instrument. That's something I always make sure that my students, keep in mind. I tell them, just forget you're a bass player. Just try to pretend you're a vocalist, and just try to bring the nuances of a vocalist onto the bass. And we have a major advantage point, like unlike the piano, for example, the vibes, if you go from like C to C sharp, there's, you can't do a glissando, it's basically, the notes are everything is like kind of broken up, from, in half steps. But on the bass, just like a vocalist, we have the advantage of being able to have a glissando from one note to the next. And that's pretty much the most vocal-like thing, that we can think of. So that's a great advantage point that we can really use in order to be more expressive, in our soloing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just incredible the breadth and depth of styles and people you've played with and projects you've done, and I just love to know. So we were talking about those Manhattan School of Music years, and then maybe we could just look at some of what you look as some pivotal points in your career going forward from that. People that you began playing with, real things that really stand out as highlights for you looking back.
Yeah, definitely. Well, my first major gig after Manhattan School of Music, about like a year after I graduated in 2004, was with Eldar Jangirov, great, talented pianist, originally from Kyrgyzstan, but he moved to the U.S. when he was 10 years old, and amazing talent. I mean, when I worked with him, I met him when he was about 15. We met on a gig that was put together by Dr. Billy Taylor, the great jazz educator that was working at, with the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. So he invited me and him and other talented musicians to do this week-long program. Basically we would go into like some high schools in the area and teach the younger students. And then we had a couple of final concerts. So that's where we met. We kept in touch, and a year later, Eldar got signed to Sony, and he did his debut recording with John Petitucci and Michael Brecker. Amazing cream of the crop musicians, and so he needed to start a touring band, in order to promote the record. So he called me and he gave me a bunch of gigs, and then I ended up playing with him for 3 years. And we played all over the world. You know, we're in Japan, all over Europe, all over the U.S. And one of the 2 records that we made together got nominated for a Grammy. So I can't call myself properly a Grammy nominated artist in my own name, you know, but I'm, you know, I'm proud to say that I'm part of a Grammy nominated recording, you know, which was definitely an important landmark for me. And then after that, I started working with great pianists like Eric Reed and Dado Moroni, great pianist from Italy who used to live in New York. And we've toured a bunch in Europe with a great drummer Alvin Queen, a New Yorker, you know, who's been living in Switzerland, you know, for the past couple of decades. And that was a really swinging experience. And with Dado, we also had the pleasure of doing a trio recording with Peter Erskine out in Los Angeles for Resonance Records, a great label. And so, you know, there was all this great freelance work. And over the past few years, I've tried to branch out a little more and kind of embrace more of my versatility in terms of, like, I kind of got a little frustrated that I was not playing enough electric bass, which was my first love. You know, before I even started playing the double bass, I started out on electric. And I really wanted to put myself in a position where I'd be able to make myself more known for my versatility. Because up to that point, you know, up to like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I'd been pigeonholed as, you know, just someone, you know, who just does straight ahead jazz, right, you know, and it kind of started to bother me because I felt that I really wanted to make myself known, you know, for all the other styles that I love playing, you know, on double bass or electric bass. So for me, you know, the culmination of this experience, you know, was the opportunity to start subbing for the great Tom Barney at Lion King, you know, which luckily is only a 5-minute walk from my place here in Manhattan. So it's very convenient. That's a good gig. But for me, you know, that gig is great, you know, whenever I get a chance to do it, because the gig consists of, you know, I have to play both electric bass and double bass. Yeah. And the show, basically, musically speaking, runs the gamut of all styles. I mean, like, whenever I'm playing the double bass, it's really, like, legit orchestral stuff. So, you know, there's, you know, a lot of, you know, great orchestral moments, you know, with the strings, you know, with the, you know, the violins, the violas, and the cellos. So in that moment, I go into, like, full classical mode. But then, like, 5 seconds later, I put the upright down and I start like a South African groove on electric bass, you know? So for me, that's really satisfying. And also get like my cardio routine, you know, because basically I have to jump, literally jump, you know, like sometimes I have like, you know, 10 seconds off, you know, between putting down the upright and picking up the electric again. So, you know, there's a lot of moving around in the pit, you know, but you know, it's really satisfying, like on a musical point of view, because basically I get to do something that allows me to, you know, play both instruments in a number of styles. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's really rewarding. It's something that I was kind of starting to miss, and so, you know, now I'm starting to get ready to sub on Frozen, you know, another Broadway show, where it's going to be the same thing. I mean, I know that it's both, you know, a lot of double bass and a lot of electric bass, you know, at the same time. So I'm really looking forward to another opportunity to really play both instruments in a number of different styles. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. I can picture you jumping back and forth between the instruments, getting your cardio.
It is definitely a lot of cardio. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of cardio, you're known for walking your bass around 2 gigs on the subway. And I put out on Facebook, what topics would you like us to cover? And that definitely came up. Yeah, so, right. Talk about that particularly New York experience of taking your bass not in a car. What's that like?
Well, I mean, you know, there are very few people here in New York, especially musicians, that own a car because it's kind of unnecessary. First of all, the parking fees, if you want to park in a lot, you know, or they're very, very, very steep. You know, it's very, very expensive. You know, like here in Midtown Manhattan, a permanent parking spot in a covered lot, would be about $700 a month or more if you have an SUV, So it's like basically paying a mortgage, just to park your car, and then there's all sorts of chances of getting tickets,
right?
And then you have maintenance and gas and all that. So the nice thing about New York is that it's a very geographically compact kind of city. Mm-hmm. Everything is kind of within walking distance, and it's very flat for most of it. So I live in Midtown Manhattan near Times Square. If I have a gig in the Village or if I have a gig on the Upper West Side or the Upper East Side, I won't think twice about walking there. It's about like maybe 3 to 4 miles walking. It takes about 1 hour to like 90 minutes, but it's really great. I mean, but sometimes I do have to make sure that I carry clothes for the performance, because I don't want to get there all sweaty in my tux and all that,
Well, I just love this so much because I feel like I found a kindred spirit. I always felt like I was the only one who would walk his bass 3 or 4 miles. I do that myself in San Francisco.
That's beautiful.
And I have a double challenge, I will tell you, and you could probably relate. I have to walk my bass first through the financial district. So it's very busy with people in suits moving quickly. Then through a neighborhood I know, the Tenderloin, which is a very different kind of strangeness. Do you have any favorite strange moments walking the bass, either taking it to the subway or walking it around, that thinking back, anything, whether it's people calling out things?
Well, I'm sure that most of the people who are listening to this podcast are bass players, so they can totally relate. If I had a dime for every time I've been asked, is that a cello? I'd be a millionaire by now, So, the standard questions, is that a cello? Or, gee, that's a big guitar. How much does it weigh? Don't you wish you played the flute? I hear all sorts of stuff, especially in the touristy areas, near here, like Times Square. And one thing I've learned is that I have to try to avoid Times Square as much as possible because I can literally get stuck there. Mm-hmm. Because it's most of the times, it's visitors, who come maybe from a place, where the tallest building is like 4 stories high. So, everybody's like gawking up, kind of looking at those tall buildings and the lights, So, trying to walk in the middle of all that with a bass is not a good idea. So sometimes I just make my path, I just make it like it takes me like an extra 15 minutes because I purposely have to try and avoid Times Square, So I wouldn't recommend walking through Times Square with a bass.
I got the same move in San Francisco because, native New Yorkers getting to work or something like that, they're in a hurry. They'll move around you.
Totally.
I find in the financial district, people, they see the bass and sometimes they register a little surprise, but they get out of my way. But tourist areas, I try to avoid too. Fisherman's Wharf or anything like families moving slowly, blocking the whole sidewalk, looking up. Yeah,
everybody's like waiting to board their ferry or to Alcatraz. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Apply graphite, like pencil lead, to the bridge and nut, the contact points of the string, to ensure the strings slide smoothly on their way up to tension. This prevents them from getting stuck and unwinding or pulling the bridge so that it leans. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And Steve has been researching top regraduation for many years. Here's Steve on the topic.
I found some old diagrammed bass tops in an old violin making book that had violins, violas, cellos, and only 4 basses from kind of the classic period, the early 1800s. And I took a pattern of kind of a topographical map of thicker in the center under the bridge, and then, the thinnest is right near the edges, just before it flares out and gets strong again. And I put in some measurements that I thought would work, and we use that as a general pattern for top regraduation, and it really works.
You would be amazed how well this technique works. I've been impressed time and time again at how immediately a bass speaks after coming from Steve's shop and how resonant and beautiful and open the sound is. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. So somebody wrote in another, I'm thinking of some of the things that people asked, and I will give you the prompt, and maybe you remember the story. They said, ask Marco about driving between here and Brooklyn. We listened to the same CD over and over for like forever. What is that story?
That's right. Yeah. Well, basically, I did. In Boston, I did have a car, and for my last year when I was living there, and so when I moved to New York, I moved to Brooklyn, and in Brooklyn, having a car is much more manageable because the parking is easier and all that. So I did keep a car for my first 2 years here in New York City when I was still living in Brooklyn, and I remember that. There's this bass player that I forgot to mention him, but he's probably like my number one influence of all. His name is Dario Deida. He's a great bass player who is equally proficient at both the double bass and the electric bass. I mean, he has a degree in classical double bass in Italy, but his real love is the electric bass. And living in Italy, there weren't many people that knew about him, but now, it's really starting to get known worldwide. I mean, thanks to the internet, of course, and the fact that he's starting to play a lot with Kurt Rosenwinkel, a great jazz guitar player who's known worldwide. So he's finally getting his due. But I learned a lot from him, because what he's done, is like he grew up in a musical family. His brothers and his dad, were all playing music. So he's very proficient at bass, piano, trumpet, drums. I mean, he can play like any instrument and really in a competent way. I mean, it's not just like messing around, on his non-main instruments. He's really like, he could do a gig, like a legit gig on all those instruments. And so what he did was that basically he would memorize entire, Coltrane solo from like, the late 50s. And so his soloing basically has a lot of horn-like qualities. I mean, it really sounds like John Coltrane on the bass, like pretty mind-blowing. So he's been a major influence of mine. So I took a few lessons from him before I moved to the United States. And I had them on a tape, because, back then, I mean, the 90s, we're still using cassette tapes. And so when I moved to Brooklyn, I would commute to Manhattan, almost every day for like gigs here and there. And so I would play these tapes of those lessons with him and I did it for like almost 2 years. And so I basically memorized most of his solos away from the bass just by listening to them over and over again. And there was like an amazing learning experience, because like I was listening to that stuff every day. And then like when I picked up the bass, when I would pick up the bass, I would basically find all those solos under my fingers without having really like transcribed them or practiced them.
Wow.
Just from listening over and over and over again, So is definitely a main influence for me. And I'm really excited about the fact that the teacher and student, kind of relationship evolved into like now is my peer, like 20 years later. And I've had the pleasure of putting out a CD with him. It's basically like a duo live CD where I play upright bass and he plays electric. And, for anyone who's interested, it's available online. Just look it up under my name and Daryudeda's name. It's called Bass Live Duo. And basically, I always, tell this story to my students, because I encourage them to practice and learn, even away from their instrument. Yeah. I mean, you don't necessarily have to have a bass in your hands in order to improve, your knowledge of harmony and soloing and all that. Yep.
Yeah. It's remarkable what you can do away from the instrument and that synthesis. And it's so cool that you're making that drive and then you pick up the bass and it's just there.
Yeah. Just like listening to the same thing over and over again. That's
Wow. I always forget to ask people about gear, and then people write in and say, "Why didn't you ask Marco about his gear?" So, could you just briefly, as much as you want to, just what upright bass are you playing? Tell us about that. Electric bass, amp, any of those details.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Well, when it comes to double basses, everybody knows me as a bass hoarder. But basically, there was a point where, in the living room where we are right now, there were something like 10 double basses. I mean, I kid you not, there was basically not enough room to walk, because there was, all the corners were taken, so there were like, 4 or 5 basses on the floor, like kind of, it was, you had to kind of navigate yourself, through them, but I did eventually, pare down, because I realized, that whole 10 basses in the living room was like totally unsustainable, and not leading to a good quality of life, So right now I've just pared down to 2. I have basically a hybrid new standard, so it went through the shop of Arno Schnitzer and Will DeSola, they put it together, and it's a really amazing instrument. Because I wish it had a little more low end, like a little more of a bassy tone, but it cuts through like a knife. It has an amazing mid range and top, range, that especially in a recording session, it really makes the bass stick out, like anything else, So that's why I ended up selling, tons of basses. I've had a lot of Juseks. But I ended up selling them all, because none of them would give me, this like cut through, kind of quality, that I get from this La Scala new standard. So that's why I've held on to it since 2006. And then I have a 1951K plywood bass, like old American plywood, that it's generally what I use, for unplugged gigs. Where I don't want to bring an amp, because it's like super loud. Yeah. It may not have a whole lot of definition. I mean, there's like a whole scoop in the mid range. But when it comes to like those gigs where I don't want to bother bringing an amp and all I need is like, a big boomy tone, then that it definitely delivers. And I have a gut string, for my G. I have an old golden spiral, and it's still working, I think it's like a 20-year-old string, but it still delivers. And, so these are my 2 basses right now. Then I also have, for traveling, an alter ego, electric upright that I'm really, really happy about. And, when it comes to electric basses, I have a couple of basses, made by Mike Lal, a great luthier out of, Bellevue near Seattle, Washington. Made to my specs, I kind of went a little crazy with the custom options, so the last project, took like, a year and a half, for them to deliver it, because I was just like getting a little too outlandish, with my requests, but they got it done and they did a great job. And also I have a couple of old Fenders. I have a 1972 Telecaster, 1973 Precision, and I've been using Mark bass amps, for, over 10 years at this point. This is pretty much it.
With this might be a hard question to answer, but I'll just throw it out there anyway. Let's say somebody's starting out on bass or starting out really developing an interest in jazz.
Yeah.
Maybe they're 16 or 17, and they ask you, Marco, I want to pick up 3, 4, 5 albums. Where would you have somebody in that position start? What are some of the albums that you think would get them going?
Well, that's definitely challenging, because there's so much great stuff out there, but I mean, I would definitely recommend that they pick up a lot of Miles Davis, like Kind of Blue and even Beaches Brew, they're very, very different albums, but there's definitely a lot of great musicianship in both of them. And, of course, The Love Supreme by John Coltrane. And, it's really hard to recommend. I mean, there are so many albums that I love, but right now I can't pinpoint other ones in particular.
Those are two great ones. Those are
you'd have to double check with me in a couple of days.
That's okay. That's okay. And maybe again, just I'm throwing these wide questions out. What if that same student said, "I'm going to go on YouTube, or I'm going to go look up on Spotify some bassists"? Who are some of those? There are hundreds that we could recommend, but just a few that would really get them going, get them thinking, get the sound in their ear.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I would encourage everyone to recommend stuff from Dario Deida, this great bass player from Italy that I mentioned before. And, I would encourage them to check out as much stuff by, Ron Carter, Ray Brown, Christian McBride, Larry Grenadier. There are just so many great bass players. And also, a lot of my peers, there are some really great bass players out there, doing their thing, my friend Denny Zeman, for example. I would recommend to all my students, to get his books, The Lowdown. Because they have some great information on how to build a proper, and tasteful, bass line. So, those are the first names that come to mind. But, of course, there's tons and tons more.
Right. And, of course, you're so humble. But I will say, check out Marco Panacea. And, so many great videos up on YouTube, so many great album credits, and that duo album, which I've listened to and really enjoy.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
And I appreciate this. This is super fun. You're an incredibly great interview guest. So I usually wrap up, and I would love to do this again. I love having people back. So let's have a round 2 sometime. But go back to, I usually say go back and talk to 25-year-old Marco or 18-year-old Marco or whatever point in your life you can think of, and give him some advice from where you're at now. What would you tell young Marco? Given what you know?
Well, I would probably tell him to kind of get out of his bubble. I mean, kind of just concentrating just on his bass playing and trying to really concentrate on making music within a group. I remember I took a couple of lessons with John Clayton, and a couple of the things he said really kind of stuck with me. I think about them, almost every day that I'm playing music, within a band. As bass players, when we develop, we realize that we're able to do few nice things technically, this and that. We kind of, it's easy for us to kind of get sucked into that and kind of just pay too much attention, to what we're doing, on the bass. But the truth is that when we're playing with a band, we really have to put the band first. I mean, the sound of the band first. So a lot of times we might be tempted to do a fill or playing, more notes that are necessary. It might seem like a cool idea at the moment, and it's something that probably mostly younger musicians, would tend to do, because there's kind of this tendency to, show off, the technical stuff that they've learned. But it may not necessarily be the best musical decision for the band at that given moment. So basically that's what John told me. He told me, if you're, whenever you're playing with a band, with a quartet, with a quintet, if you realize you're paying more attention to what you're doing on the bass, more so than what the other musicians are doing, then it means that you must be doing something wrong. You have to kind of learn to be a little more unselfish and kind of take a step back and try to really pay attention to what the other musicians are doing. Because if you think about it, when you're playing within a band, you're really having a conversation, just like you and I. Mm-hmm. But instead of using words, we're using notes. So it really makes no sense if each one of these 4 or 5 musicians kind of goes their own way, just concentrating on what they're doing on their instrument instead of creating something together. And when I was younger, this is something I really lacked on. I was really just too invested in what I was doing on the bass because I wanted to prove to the world, that I was cool, that I could, be able to do a certain number of things on my instrument. But then that really distracted me from really building a conversation with the other band members. So the one advice that I would give to the young Marco and like any young musicians who was coming up is to, take a step back and really challenge themselves, to be a little less selfish musically and like really trying to think of the big picture. And if they want to do that cool feel, just kind of ask themselves, is this really going to be the right musical choice for the band at that moment? Is it going to be too much, or am I going to step on the soloist's toes? That kind of thing. So this is definitely the most important advice. Like really think of making music first and foremost, and not just get too invested in just what we are as like single individual instrumentalists. Really think of the big picture.
Yeah, that's so important. And that just that learning the art of that conversation and which you have mastered so well on the bass and in person. You're a wonderful interview. So this is a lot of fun. And I appreciate you and what you do, and MarcoPanacea.com, and check him out on YouTube and Facebook and all social media. You could see him play bass. He posts a lot, and it's just super inspiring. And I love what you do, and keep it up. And I can't wait to hang out again soon.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure.
Marco, thanks again. Great to chat with you, especially in person. And folks, learn more about Marco and everything he's up to at his website, MarcoPanacea.com. What fun. I just love doing these conversations, and I can't wait for the next trip like this. We got many other episodes coming to you from this New York trip, or several more at this point. But can't wait. Lots of travel in the future for me, for the podcast, for sure. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the people, the sponsors that we've mentioned. So I do want to thank them for these trips, and it wouldn't be possible without this great team of people that are working on the podcast. I started this podcast back in 2007, and I let it die on the vine for 5 years, from 2011 to 2016, something like that, 2010 to 2015. I don't remember exactly. Why did I let it go? I got busy. And it was just me. I moved out to San Francisco, had some more time on my hands, rebooted it, and of course, what happens in life? You get busy. So I'm busy again, and this podcast would have vanished at least a year ago, maybe more than that, if I didn't have this great team. So I just want to give a big shout out to the team. That team is Steve Hinchy and Michael Cooper, who edit these interviews, and you would not believe the time it takes to edit these interviews. Oh, it's phenomenal. You might not think it's that much work if you're just listening, but my goodness, it is a lot of work. So thank you to both of them. Also, Trevor Jones, who is doing the scheduling, he's doing the promotion, he's doing the email list, he's doing so many other things, and all these things that I could not do myself. Couldn't happen. And Mitch Mooring, who is going through and putting all these episodes together. Again, a big task, and Mitch is much better at it than me. His episodes that he produces sound way better than what I used to do. So thank you to Mitch. And then Krista Copper, my goodness, going through and cataloging and archiving all of these episodes. time stamping when we talk about specific topics. That allows us to do best of episodes and highlight episodes and projects like Winning the Audition, where we all are covering on these different episodes similar topics, and to be able to thematically group things and put out new content, different voices on similar topics, that's just magical. That could not happen without Krista. So thank you, Krista. So again, thank you, Steve, Michael, Mitch, Krista, and Trevor. Oh my goodness, I'm so thrilled to have you all on board. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.